Okay, so this is self-determination. It's the right of people to freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. Okay, so it's basically people's rights to freely assert their sovereignty and political status. It's a collective right, okay? It's not an individual right. Why? Because you can't just have self-determination. You can't just govern yourself. You need a group of people to govern. That's the idea, that you on your own can't have kind of like a political status, but it needs to be a group of people who share a political status that needs to be protected. That's the idea of self-determination, not to be confused with universal suffrage. Universal suffrage is about voting. Self-determination is about people being able to govern themselves and their own land, particularly Indigenous people, okay? So what we had in the history of modern day civilization, we had colonization of many different states throughout the world, okay? Particularly by French, Italians, Spanish, English. A lot of kind of those countries were the big colonial powers. So what ended up happening at the end of the 18th century into the 19th century, into the 20th century, is we had these colonized countries that they didn't have. For example, like the Philippines. Philippines was colonized by the Spaniards, or the Spanish, and we basically had the idea of empires or big colonial powers living in and controlling states that they did not have the right to. So we had the process of decolonization throughout the 20th century that basically removed their power from the states that they were kind of seizing at that time. So the Philippines regained power. Different states that had been colonized by these colonial powers gained their power back, which was obviously a really good thing, right? That's self-determination. They're able to regain government control of themselves and their land and make decisions about themselves. Unfortunately, this hasn't been the case for Indigenous Australians. Self-determination hasn't really at all been achieved for Indigenous Australians. Another thing, the Treaty of Westphalia shifted countries away from imperialistic rule and towards a nationalist identity, which is what I was talking about, right? That period of decolonization. It was listed first in the Atlantic Charter by Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, so I would definitely be mentioning this if I was talking about the nature and development of self-determination. We do have free and fair elections and an operative system of independent government. However, in Australia with Atsi people, as I mentioned, we do not have self-determination like at all, which is something else that you would certainly want to make note of in your response. In terms of international responses, we have Article 1, Section 2 of the UN Charter and Article 15 of the UDHR. So why do I keep mentioning these international documents that source these human rights or discuss these human rights? Because I would recommend in legal studies, whenever you're responding to a human rights question about a particular right, always my next sentence after my first sentence would be, so first sentence would be me defining the human right. So let's say if I was asked about self-determination, my first sentence would be defining what self-determination is, saying that it's a collective right. And then my second sentence would be saying something along the lines of self-determination is covered under international law, specifically under Article 1, Section 2 of the UN Charter and Article 15 of the UDHR. Always, always, always where you can, state where we can find in international law and domestic law, if possible, the protection of a given human right, whatever the one that you're looking at is.